Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of forgotten time. Settle in. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the flicker of imagination guide you backward, far beyond the glow of your screen or the steady hum of modern plumbing. Tonight, we drift gently into the Middle Ages, not with drama, not with battle cries, but through the silent, stubborn scent of everyday life, through dust and darkness, through grime and grit. This journey isn't about knights or kings, but about a far simpler and often overlooked reality. It's about dirt. It's about how people lived with it, worked around it, ignored it, or feared it, in a time when clean was as much a matter of belief as it was of water and soap. Picture yourself stepping onto the creaky wood of a medieval floor, your bare feet brushing against rough straw scattered to soak up the filth of everyday existence outside. The streets aren't paved but pulped with mud and refuse, where pigs root freely and children dash barefoot among puddles no one wants to identify. The year might be 1320 or 1389 or even later, but the smell, oh, the smell is always the same, a blend of sweat, rot, wood smoke, and humanity. And you're not just reading about it, you're standing in it, you're breathing it in, you are part of it now. There's no rush here, no need to hurry. Let the filth settle around you as it did around them, century after century, because in the world we're stepping into, hygiene is not a daily routine. It's a philosophical question, and often a religious one. You might ask, why didn't they just bathe more often? Why not clean the streets, change their clothes, scrub the floors? But to ask is to forget that comfort, as we know it, is a modern invention in this world. Water could be dangerous, privacy was scarce, and bodies were seen not only as vessels of labor, but sometimes as vessels of sinew. May find it strange to learn that many people believe too much bathing could weaken the body or open the pores to illness, and so they stayed away from baths, letting the skin crust over with the evidence of time and toil. It wasn't laziness, it was fear, it was faith, it was the slow rhythm of survival. Imagine an elderly woman kneeling near her hearth, wiping her hands not on soap and towel, but on the same apron she's worn all year. Her skin is weathered, her nails are black at the tips from tending the fire and digging in the soil. And yet she sings while she works. There's pride in her movements, no shame, no apology, just the quiet certainty. His feet caked in filth, his hair thick with dust, is alive, buzzing with flies, ringing with the calls of traders, clanking with the echo of hooves over stone. To him, this is normal. To him, this is home. Even the nobility, wrapped in layers of wool and velvet, were not immune to the odor of existence. Perfumes masked but never erased, silks hid sweat but never stopped it, and beneath the courtyards and halls lay chamber pots, and behind castle walls the same stinking channels that emptied into rivers downstream. No one was clean. Not really, not as we would define it, but still. They lived, they loved, they danced and married and mourned, they endured. See, cleanliness is a lens. It's something we apply when we look back, but they didn't have that lens. They had cold winters and smoky fireplaces. They had straw beds and shared garments. They had faith that suffering purified the soul, and that bodies full of desire and scent were meant to be contained, not indulged in. As you sit now, wrapped in your own quiet world, perhaps with a blanket or the gentle whir of a fan nearby, there is something oddly comforting in their story. It reminds us that discomfort is not the enemy, that people have always managed with less. and sometimes even found peace in the dirt. So tonight, we begin not with drama, but with stillness, not with judgment, but with curiosity. As we walk through their muddy paths and smoky rooms, let us do so not with wrinkled noses, but with open minds, because this, dear listener, is not just boring history. This is real life, and for the next 2 hours, we will live it together, one breath, one story, one dirty truth at a time. Let the grime of the past settle gently on your thoughts, and do not worry about the smell. It fades. Eventually, the morning begins, not with an alarm, but with the rising scent of smoke and damp straw. The rooster crows somewhere in the distance. But most don't need it. They've already been stirring, their bodies trained by years of rhythm and routine. There is no faucet to splash your face, no mirror to greet your reflection. The air is cool and musty inside your home, which is not quite a room but a space, a single shared chamber, where sleeping, eating, and breathing all happen in close company beneath your feet. The floor is not made of polished wood or smooth tile. It is dirt, sometimes hard-packed, sometimes loose and gritty, sometimes soaked with things best left unnamed. Straw is scattered across it in handfuls, changed occasionally, but not often enough. It serves to absorb moisture, mud, and worse, and so you walk across it with care, not out of disgust, but simply because you know which patch creaks when stepped on, or where the smell of yesterday still lingers. Outside, the streets are no better. They are not paved, nor are they swept. They are simply the ground trod over by oxen and horses, churned by wheels and hooves, splashed by chamber pots, hurled from second-story windows with only a shout of warning if that the rain turns it to soup, the summer sun bakes it into cracked earth. Either way, it clings to boots, to hems, to bare ankles. It follows you. A merchant's stall smells like salted fish and dried sweat. A blacksmith's forge burns away the stink of iron, with a stronger stench of singed hair and wet leather. At the tanner's workshop, the odor is so sharp, so deep, that it lives in your nostrils even after you've passed, and you're used to it. It's not pleasant, but it's normal. People don't wash their clothes every day. Some don't even own more than one set. Clothes are precious, hand-stitched, often repaired over and over again, until the patches are more fabric than the original garment. You sleep in them, you work in them, you eat, walk, sweat, and yes, relieve yourself in them if you must. To undress completely is rare, almost sacred, reserved for special moments, like a holy washing or the deathbed. Nakedness is not casual, it is vulnerable. Even fingernails tell stories, long, curved, stained with earth or ash. Men, women, children, they all carry the marks of their daily labor. Hands are worn like tools, not pampered, not manicured. They knead bread, tend fire, pull weeds, swat flies, wipe spills, and cradle babies. They are never idle. There is dust, endless, soft, persistent dust. It gathers on windowsills, where sunlight catches the shadows. It rests in the folds of wool and clings to corners like shy ghosts. You may wipe it away, but it returns, as if to remind you that the outside world always finds a way in. And in truth, no one expects a spotless home. It would be strange if it were clean, uncomfortable. Even a space to tidy would feel cold and unlived. You do not have soap as you know it now. Maybe you have ashes, or sand, or lye if you're lucky. Scrubbing is more about friction than foam. You use what you have: a rough cloth, A splash of water fetched from a stream down the hill, a stream that cows drink from, that children splash in, that someone upstream might use to wash a bloodied rag or dump an old bucket, but it's water. And it's yours. Food preparation is done with bare hands. Always meat is butchered in the open air, left hanging for flies. To find bread is kneaded and risen in a bowl that hasn't been properly cleaned in weeks, but it still works. No one is measuring temperature or counting calories. There is no fridge, there is no best buy date. There is hunger, and there is food, and that's enough. Your bed is a shared one. You may lie beside your siblings, your spouse, your children, or even a neighbor's child needing shelter for the night. Blankets are rarely washed, pillows are uncommon. You sleep wrapped in your cloak or a spare sack. You itch sometimes from fleas or lice. You scratch and shift and snore, but still you sleep, and when you wake, you rise into the same air, the same dust, the same dirt that surrounds you every day. Cleanliness is not measured in scent, it is measured in function. Can you work? Can you move? Can you survive? If the answer is yes, then you are clean enough, of course. There are moments, very rare ones, when someone may visit a bathhouse or bathe in a river. These are more social than hygienic, an event, not a routine. But for most, those moments come and go, and the dust remains. It settles in the folds of skin, in the crook of your neck, behind the ears, under the knees, and yet you are alive. Your body endures, and so you carry on. You don't think of yourself as filthy. You don't look at your hands and flinch. This is your world. Your smells, your stains, your story. There is a strange peace in the repetition, in the acceptance, because when no one is clean, no one is judged, and when the air is always thick, your senses adjust. You stop noticing, and that, too, is survival. So as we stand now in the middle of this dusty path, surrounded by the gentle filth of medieval daily life, let us not turn away. Let us breathe it in slowly, without shame, and continue walking. Imagine waking up after weeks of toil, your skin stiff with layers of sweat and earth, your clothes soaked with the smell of long days and long nights. You feel it, that sticky discomfort under your arms, behind your neck, between your toes, and yet you don't rush to clean it off, not because you don't want to, but because you can't, because in the world you live in, bathing isn't a simple act. It's not routine. It's not private. It's not even safe for most people in the medieval world. The idea of bathing daily or even weekly is nearly unimaginable. Water isn't just turned on with a handle. It must be fetched, bucket by bucket, from a stream or well, heated by firewood that you chopped yourself or bought with hard-earned coin, carried carefully indoors, poured into a wooden tub that might leak, that might creak, and that's probably been used by others before you. It's a task, an ordeal, and in many cases, maybe before a holy day, maybe before a wedding, maybe when illness clings too tightly, sometimes not even then, and even when the opportunity arises, many are hesitant because bathing is not always considered good for the body. There are beliefs deeply rooted, passed down through generations, that water opens the pores, lets sickness in, and weakens the vital humors of the flesh. To immerse yourself, naked and vulnerable, in warm water is to invite danger, not just from the elements, but from unseen forces, miasmas, spirits, sin. And so, people get creative. They rub themselves with cloth, with oil, with ashes. They scrape the skin with dull knives or stones, hoping to remove what the water cannot. They dry wash dusting the body with herbs or powders, and most of all, they simply accept the layer of dirt as part of life. It is not a flaw, it is a shield. But this doesn't mean no one ever bathed in towns and cities across Europe. Bathhouses existed, some were private, some public, some tied to monasteries at their peak. They were lively places filled with steam, chatter, and sometimes mischief. A hot bath in a wooden tub lined with cloth could be a treat. The room might be lit with flickering candles. Herbs like rosemary or lavender might be tossed into the water, not just for fragrance, but for health, or so they believed. You would undress, stepping into the shared warmth. The water wasn't crystal clear, it was reused, darkened with the touch of many bodies, but it was warm, and for a time, you might feel refreshed. Your limbs loosened, your mind calmed. But even this ritual came with risk. People whispered that bathhouses were sinful, that too much exposure to nakedness tempted the flesh and the soul, that men and women, often separated only by thin walls or veils, might stray into vice. And beyond the moral concerns, there were fears of plague when illness swept through a town. Bathhouses were among the first places to be closed. Steam, sweat, mingled breath was the perfect recipe for contagion, and so the baths fell out of favor, first in whispers, then by law. In many places, they were outlawed altogether, and still, some persisted in their own quiet rituals. A noblewoman might bathe in her chamber, guarded by screens, surrounded by servants who carried in the water jug by jug. She might scrub with linen cloth, dabbed in rose water or vinegar. She might soak her feet in a basin, the only part of her body allowed such indulgence. And even this was rare. A monk, on the other hand, might bathe according to the rules of his order. Some monasteries permitted a bath once a month, others once a season, but the act was silent, humble, performed without pleasure. It was cleansing of the spirit more than the skin. Children were washed more frequently, especially infants. Mothers feared for their health and believed that keeping a child too dirty might invite demons or disease. But even then, it was not about sparkle and shine, it was about survival. And what of the rivers? Surely people bathed there. Yes, they did when the weather allowed, and when the river wasn't poisoned by the waste of those upstream. But it was public. It was chilly, and it carried its own dangers. Slippery stones, strong currents, watchful eyes. Bathing outside meant exposure, both physical and social. So, instead, many people focused on parts. They washed their hands before meals. At least when water was available, they wiped their faces with damp cloths. Feet were sometimes soaked at the end of a long day, not for comfort, but to keep them working. These were not full baths, but gestures, efforts to manage the body without exhausting the resources and the smells. They were simply part of life. People perfumed themselves when they could. They hung bundles of herbs in their clothes. They chewed cloves, mint, or parsley to freshen the breath. They burned incense, but these were surface solutions. The core truth remained unchanged. Everyone stank to one degree or another, and because they all stank together, it became invisible. No one expected roses. No one sought the sterile. The world was too alive, too busy, too hard. Bathing wasn't forgotten. It was remembered with longing, or with fear, or with reverence. It was a ritual, a risk, and a relief, all in one. But it was not ordinary. And so you, as a medieval soul, live in layers, layers of fabric, layers of skin, layers of grime. Your outer shell may crust and harden, But your spirit adapts. You find comfort where you can. A warm fire, a soft bed of straw, the weight of a blanket that smells like wood smoke, and time you, breathe you endure, and once, maybe twice a year, when the stars align, the mood is right, and the fire is hot enough, you wash, truly wash, and for a few brief hours, you feel the ghost of lightness on your skin until the dirt returns. Like an old friend, because in this world, bathing isn't always an option, but life goes on anyway, asterisk. Step through the heavy wooden door and into the thick haze of steam. The room is alive with warmth, with murmured voices echoing off the stone walls. With the soft splash of water against wood, it smells of heat and herbs, of wet towels, of skin that has not seen soap in months. You're standing in a medieval bathhouse, and despite everything you've heard about the grime of the era, this place feels like an oasis or brief pause in the slow chaos of the outside world. Bathhouses weren't always rare, in fact. There was a time when they were remarkably common. Cities like Paris, London, and Prague had dozens, sometimes hundreds of them. They lined busy streets, advertised with signs carved with steaming tubs or hanging towels. Some were modest single rooms with wooden barrels and a simple fire to heat the water. Others were elaborate, with multiple chambers, heated floors, marble benches, and perfumed oils for those who could afford the pleasure. And they were popular, very popular. Men and women came to soak, to sweat, to relax. They came to clean their bodies, yes, but also to socialize, to catch up on gossip, to discuss business, and to enjoy the rare sensation of being warm and still. In many bathhouses, men and women bathed separately, but in others, especially in Germany and parts of Central Europe, they bathed together, nude, or nearly so, not because they were shameless, but because the shame we carry today wasn't yet invented in the same way. To be naked was natural. To be together was ordinary. Bathing, after all, was not yet linked with sensuality. It was a routine, a relief, even a necessity. But not everyone was comfortable with this arrangement. As bathhouses grew in popularity, so did the rumors. Whispers began to swirl that the warm waters were a cover for something else, that behind the steamy curtains sin brewed, that young men and women found more than heat in each other's company. And where suspicion grows, regulation follows. The church watched with narrowing eyes. Priests warned from their pulpits that the flesh, already weak, became weaker in the comfort of a bath, that nakedness led to temptation, that co-bathing blurred the lines between hygiene and desire. Bathhouses began to earn a reputation, not just as places of cleanliness, but of moral decay, and slowly they became a target. Some were shut down entirely. Others were forced to separate men and women more strictly. In places where bathhouses were tied to monasteries or hospitals, the rules became stricter, the experience colder and more somber. But the people still came, because despite the risks, despite the rumors, the pull of warm water was hard to resist. You must understand, life was exhausting. The work was physical. The winters were cruel. To sit in a steaming bath, even for a short time, was a kind of rebirth. It soothed aching muscles. It softened cracked skin. It made you feel human again. Bathhouses also served a practical purpose. In many cities, they were places to treat illness, to clean wounds, to perform small surgeries. Barber surgeons would set up in a corner, offering tooth pulling and lancing alongside a soak. Herbalists might rub scented oils into sore joints. Midwives bathed women before and after childbirth. These were not luxuries, they were services, woven into the fabric of life. Still, as time passed and fear grew, more restrictions followed, and then came the plague when the Black Death swept across Europe. People scrambled for answers. How did it spread? Why did some fall ill, while others remained untouched? And in the search for blame, bathhouses once again found themselves under fire. They were crowded, they were wet, they were steamy, all the things that terrified medieval doctors, who believed that disease traveled through foul air and moist environments. Suddenly, the same waters that once promised healing were said to breed infection. City by city, bathhouses were shuttered. Some reopened with strict limits, some never reopened at all. And so, the public bathhouse began to fade, not overnight, not with fire and drama, but slowly, quietly, a forgotten luxury, a ghost of warmth in its place. People turned to smaller, private rituals, a sponge in a corner, a washcloth dipped in vinegar, a basin by the hearth. Bathing became personal, less social, and far more rare, but the memory remained. You can still hear it in the songs and stories passed down, in the records of cities where bathhouse keepers paid extra tax for the privilege of staying open, in the longing tone of old men reminiscing about the hot steam and good conversation of their younger days. Important not to romanticize these places. They were not perfect. They were not clean in the way we think of clean. The water was reused. The tubs were shared. The towels were rarely washed, but they offered something more powerful than hygiene. They offered comfort. They offered a break from the cold. They offered community, and for that, they were cherished even as the world turned away from them. So, if you ever find yourself walking down a medieval alleyway, the stones damp with evening mist, and you hear laughter drifting from a low-lit doorway, pause, listen to the sound of water, feel the warmth, and know that inside, beyond the rising steam and the soft murmur of strangers, lies something almost sacred, a fleeting moment of relief in a world that gave so little of it. That, too, is history, and perhaps the most human kind of all. In a world where water was scarce and full-body bathing even scarcer, people turned to whatever means they could find to stay cleaner, at least feel like they were. And that brings us to medieval soap. But before you imagine bars of bright, white, lavender-scented luxury, forget everything you know, because medieval soap was a creature. All it's on it was harsh, often homemade, and definitely not gentle, the kind of soap that stung your hands if left on too long, the kind that smelled more like old fat and fire than anything fresh. And yet, it was precious, painfully crafted from scratch, and often traded like treasure. Its simplest form, medieval soap, was made from two key ingredients, animal fat and lye. The fat came from pigs, cows, or whatever livestock had recently been butchered. It had to be boiled down slowly, over open flame, thick and bubbling. The lye came from ashes, yes, ashes. People would take hardwood ashes from their hearth, soak them in water, and strain the resulting liquid through cloth or straw. That liquid was lye, strong enough to burn and powerful enough to cut through grease and grime. When the fat and the lye were finally mixed, it became something thick, yellow-brown, and slippery. Sometimes it hardened into soft cakes, but more often it stayed mushy, rough on the skin, but effective if you were lucky. You could add a few herbs, maybe thyme, maybe lavender, maybe rosemary if you were well off, but most of the time, the smell was what it was, unpleasant, But necessary soap like this was rarely used for full body washing. More often, it was for hands or for laundry, rubbing it into wool or linen garments, scrubbing at stains with a rock or knotted rope. The suds, if any, were minimal, but people trusted in the soap's strength. Even if it cracked their knuckles, not everyone could afford it. Though soap makers existed, especially in larger towns, and their craft was both valued and distrusted because they dealt in lye. They were seen as handling dangerous material. Some believed their work was unholy, especially if their soap was scented. After all, wasn't vanity a senso for many, especially in rural areas? Cleaning rituals had little to do with soap at all. Instead, people turned to nature, to herbs and powders, to oils and ashes. They rubbed crushed sage or mint under their arms to fight odor. They steeped rosemary in vinegar and dabbed it behind their ears. They burned juniper branches and let the smoke fill their homes, believing it purified not just the air, but the spirit. Cleanliness, after all, wasn't just physical. It scraping away the top layer of dirt. Others used sand, especially near rivers, to scrub their hands. It was less about killing germs, because no one knew what germs were, and more about removing what could be seen and smelled, and what couldn't be seen was left to prairie wealthier households. Rosewater became a favorite, not because it cleaned, but because it masked a splash on the wrist, a drop behind the neck. It didn't cleanse, but it comforted. It was also a symbol. If you smelled like roses, you must have money. Then there were the stranger rituals. Some people carried scented pouches filled with crushed herbs, tied to their belts or tucked into their sleeves. When a foul odor passed by, human waste, rotting meat, sickness, they'd raise the pouch to their nose and inhale deeply. Some wore these pouches around their necks, believing they protected them from disease. Doctors even stuffed their long-beaked masks with such herbs, hoping to filter out the deadly air. Others believed that rubbing the body with salt could cleanse it, not just of dirt, but of sin. Salt was sacred. It preserved food, it seasoned bland meals, and it stung in open wounds. Surely it must purify the soul. And for some, the act of fasting was a kind of cleanliness. By denying the body, they hoped to quiet its urges, purify its blood, and lighten its scent. Less food meant fewer smells. It also meant fewer stains. Clothes were another matter entirely. Washing clothes was exhausting work. There were no detergents, no washing machines. Instead, clothes were soaked in water, scrubbed with ash or lye soap, beaten on stones, then hung out to dry, sometimes in the open air, sometimes on hedges or rooftops. People might go weeks without changing their garments, simply layering new pieces on top of old underclothes. When worn, were rinsed more often, but outer garments, tunics, gowns, cloaks were left alone. After all, they were thick, they were expensive, and they were hard to dry in winter. The smell of damp wool mixed with sweat and smoke created a scent all its own. No one noticed it anymore, or rather, everyone noticed, but no one cared on. What about the hair? That too had its own rituals. Combs were used more to remove lice than to style. Hair was rarely washed. Instead, it was braided, wrapped, or covered. Oils might be applied, especially among the wealthy, to give it shine or hold it in place. But a head soaked in water was a rare sight still. There were those who took pride in their cleanliness. A knight might polish his armor and bathe before a feast. A noblewoman might scent her linens and rinse her face with milk even a shepherd, alone on the hills, might scrub his feet in a stream. After a long day, cleanliness was not common, but it was not impossible. It just looked different. So now, as you sit in your own time, in your own space, perhaps clean and comfortable, with the quiet hum of modernity around you, consider how much effort it once took to feel simply fresh, how much energy, how many rituals, how many strange little habits were stitched into everyday life, and how, even without showers or soap aisles, people still found a way. They adapted, they endured, they smelled of earth and ash and old wool, but they moved through the world with the same beating hearts, the same tired hands, the same quiet desire to feel, if only for a moment, just a little bit clean. Step into the heart of a medieval town and breathe in. Don't flinch. Don't hold your breath. Just let it happen. Let the smells wrap around you like a heavy wool cloak. Because this dense, sour, smoky atmosphere is what daily life really felt like. The air wasn't empty. It was full of people, full of animals, full of waste, full of fire, full of breath and time and decay. Imagine walking down a narrow cobblestone street, the buildings so close together you could stretch your arms and almost touch both sides above you. Wooden balconies lean and creak. Laundry hangs limp across the alley. And beneath your feet runs a thin, slick stream. But it's not water. It's runoff food scraps, grease, bits of straw, spilled ale, maybe something worse. And in every corner, every crack in the stone, the scent lingers wet, sharp. Earthy people didn't try to erase smell. They lived inside it. It told them stories. It warned them when food had gone bad. It told them when someone was sick. It helped them find the butcher's stall before they saw it. Smell wasn't something to eliminate, it was something to understand. Any bodies had their own story to tell. Men who labored in the fields carried the scent of soil and sunburnt sweat. Blacksmiths brought the odor of scorched metal and burned leather. Fishermen always had the unmistakable perfume of river rot and old nets. Even priests, wrapped in linen and incense, carried with them the ghost of candle wax and waxy skin. No one was immune. The poor smelled because they worked. The rich smelled because they could afford the layers to trap it all inside. There were attempts, of course, to control it, but not the way we do today. No deodorant, no perfume counters, no antibacterial wipes. Instead, people leaned into the idea of masking. Herbs were stuffed into pouches, sewn into collars, rubbed under arms. People wore pomanders, small metal balls filled with spices or dried flowers, around their necks or wrists. Noble women tucked lavender into their bodices. Some carried oranges stuck with cloves like tiny, fragrant shields against the world in crowded places like markets or taverns. These efforts made little difference. The mixture of smells was too much: boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, burned fat, spoiled meat, ale spilled into dirt floors, smoke from a dozen chimneys. Everything together became one single note, a sour hum that buzzed at the base of your senses. You didn't notice it until it changed. That was the real danger. A sudden shift in smell meant something had gone wrong. A body had rotted too long in the sun. A sickness had begun to spread. A new kind of smoke signaled fire, or worse, war. So people learned to read the air inside homes. The smells were quieter, but no less potent. A loaf of rye left too long, damp wool steaming near the hearth, the sharp temps of vinegar used to wipe down the table, the sour reek of chamber pots tucked under the bed. people kept the windows closed in winter, trapping everything inside, even in summer. Fresh air was no guarantee a breeze might carry in the stink of the tannery, the butcher's yard. The river choked with wasteland, yet people lived, they ate, they laughed, they sang, they got used to each other. The smell of your own family faded into the background, like wallpaper. Even lovers didn't mind a sweaty brow, a musky shoulder. These were signs of life, of work, of warmth. Cleanliness was not about scent, it was about health or luck or piety. Many believed that washing too often made you weak, that the stink of the flesh was natural, and to erase it was to defy your body. A good Christian should not be concerned with sweet smells. That was vanity, and vanity led to ruin. So, instead, people leaned into their faith. They lit incense in church. They walked through smoke before prayer. They believed that the soul could be purified, even if the skin could not. The smell of sanctity was not lavender, was frankincense, myrrh, old stone, and candle soot-tanned. Still, there was judgment. The wealthy might sniff disapprovingly at the scent of a servant. A merchant might turn up his nose at a beggar's cloak. The poor, in turn, resented the perfumed airs of nobility, not because they wanted to smell better, but because they knew what it costs. A vial of rose oil could feed a family for a week. A bar of scented soap might travel farther than its owner had ever been. And for what, to smell like someone else, to pretend the dirt wasn't real. But the dirt was always real, and so was the smell, and people learned to live inside it, to carry it, to understand that their scent was their story, where they'd been, what they'd eaten, what they'd done, who they loved, how they survived. Devon today. If you walk through an old medieval town, the scent lingers in damp stone, in heavy wood, in the musty corners of ancient churches. It's faint now, cleansed by centuries, scrubbed by rain and bleach and time. But if you breathe in deeply enough, past the tourists and coffee shops, you can still catch it, that ghost of life, stubborn and human, because smell, more than sight or sound, is memory. And the medieval world remembered itself in layers: ash, smoke, sweat, rose, blood, bread, and beneath it all, something unmistakably alive. Hair in the medieval world wasn't just hair. It was a signal, a symbol, a story, growing from the scalp. Long, short, braided, shaved, hidden, oiled. Grooming became less about style and more about survival. Let's start with the most basic truth. Lice were everywhere, absolutely everywhere, in every class. Scratched their heads. It was normal, expected, annoying, yes, but not shameful. People used fine tuft combs made of bone, ivory, or wood to drag the little creatures out. These weren't just for vanity. They were necessary tools, kept close and used daily. A person might sit quietly by the fire, slowly pulling the comb through thick strands of hair, flicking the lice into the flames. It was soothing, a ritual, a small defense against the crawl of discomfort. Children were often combed by their mothers, husbands, by wives, friends, by friends. Feel a tickle and simply ask, "Can you check my head?" And someone would look, nod, and begin the hunt. No embarrassment, just another part of the day. But lice weren't the only things in medieval hair. There were fleas, there were nits, there were tangles and mats, and so grooming became a careful balance. Too much brushing might pull out healthy hair, too little might lead to snarls that couldn't be undone. Most people simply tied their hair back. Braids were common, so were headscarves and coifs. The wind, the fire, and the dirt for men. Beards were another matter. A beard could be a sign of wisdom, of status, of strength, but it could also be dirty, tangled, full of crumbs or soot. Monks often shaved their faces. Along with their heads, soldiers might cut their beards short to keep them out of the way, but many men took pride in their facial hair, their fingers oiling it with animal fat or plant resin to make it shine. There were no razors as we know them now. Blades were sharp, but crude shaving was done with a knife. Slowly, often painfully, barbers handled the task when available. And sometimes blood was part of the bargain in cities. Barber shops were noisy places. People gathered, not just to trim their beards or cut their hair, but to talk, to argue, to joke. It was a social space, not a private one. You might walk out with a fresh face and a bandage on your cheek, and you'd call it a success. Women's hair was often longer, though rarely worn loose, unless they were young, unmarried, or scandalous. Long, unbound hair was associated with youth, wildness, or worse, sorcery. A proper woman tied her hair up, wrapped it, pinned it, covered it. It was modesty, it was status, and it was practical. Hair left loose would collect smoke, insects, sweat better to keep it controlled on special days, feast days, weddings, holy days. Hair might be washed, it might be scented with rosemary, or combed with a few drops of oil. It might be curled with heated irons, or set in braids overnight to create soft waves. These moments were rare, but treasured for a few hours. A person might feel not just clean, but beautiful. There were even remedies for hair loss, though they were creative. Some believed rubbing goose fat on the scalp would encourage growth. Others tried mashed onions or burnt herbs, and if that failed, wigs were an option, but only for the wealthy. Most just wore a hat and accepted their lot. Clean hair was a dream, not a standard. Washing the head required water, time, effort, followed by a rinse if water was available, and after all that, the hair would be stiff, dry, and smelling of smoke. Still, it was better than nothing in some regions. People used fermented liquids like beer or vinegar to rinse their hair, not for scent, for shine, for health. They believed the acidity killed lice and softened the strands, and sometimes it didn't, but it was worth a try. Grooming tools were personal treasures. A good comb might be passed down through generations. A clean rag used to tie the hair could be more valuable than jewelry, because in a dirty world, the small efforts to stay tidy were everything. Even soldiers on campaign carried combs. Even prisoners tried to shave when they could, because hair, uncontrolled, became a burden. It caught lice, it caught dirt, it caught suspicion, and in the colder months, hair mattered even more. It held warmth. A thick beard was like a scarf. A full head of hair kept out the wind. But once summer returned, the heat turned it against you. It trapped sweat, it tangled fast, and the itching never stopped still. People learned to live with it, to braid the discomfort into routine, to scratch without shame, to care for one another in small, careful ways. A comb across the scalp, a hand brushing away stray strands, a whispered thank you as the lice hissed in the fire. Because grooming wasn't about being pretty, it was about control, a tiny act of resistance against a world that never stopped pressing in. When your skin was always coated in sweat, hair was something you could manage, something you could shape, even when nothing else in your life felt clean or fair or easy. And so, under all the filth and struggle, there was still pride in a neatly braided strand, in a trimmed beard, in a headscarf tied just right. A pride that said, I am here, I am human, and I have not given up. Let's talk about the one topic no one wants to imagine, but everyone had to deal with. Bodily functions in the medieval world weren't polite. Private matters tucked behind closed doors. They were loud, they were constant, and they were shared. Because when nature called in the Middle Ages, the answer was never simple or sweet-smelling. There were no flush toilets, no scented wipes, no porcelain thrones behind frosted glass. Instead, there were holes in the ground, wooden seats balanced over pits, buckets tucked under beds, stone ledges built into castle walls that emptied straight into the moat. There was no luxury in relieving yourself, only necessity. Let's begin in the home. In most medieval cottages, especially among peasants, the toilet was, well, wherever you could find some privacy. That might be behind the barn, that might be near a tree, that might be in the same corner of the yard. Everyone else used. Some homes had a designated pit outside, sometimes surrounded by a crude wooden screen, but there was no plumbing, just a hole, and hope the waste would build up, and when the smell became unbearable, someone, usually the youngest or the lowest in the household, had to shovel it out and dig a new one inside the house. Especially at night or during storms, people used chamber pots. These were basic containers made of clay, metal, or even wood. They were kept near the bed, used quietly, then emptied in the morning into the pit, if you had one, into the river, if you lived nearby, or, more commonly, into the street. Yes, the street in many towns, especially before sanitation laws. Waste disposal was a public affair. It was common to hear the shout, "Guard," a warning cry, before someone tossed the contents of their chamber pot out the window from the upper floors of townhouses. From balconies and doorways, the waste would splash down into the gutter that ran through the center of the road, and people walked there, worked there, sold fish and bread and leather. There the smell clung to their boots and rose in the afternoon sun. In castles and monasteries, the solutions were slightly more advanced, but not always more pleasant. The chute was sometimes cleaned by rain, sometimes not. Servants might pour buckets of water down the shaft, or toss in bundles of herbs to fight the stench. But the smell always returned. It seeped into the walls, into the floor, into the close-in cities. Public privies existed. These were basic buildings, with long benches and holes. Multiple people would sit side by side. No dividers, no privacy. Conversation was common. So was gossip, and you didn't always know what you were sitting on because the wooden seats, used by hundreds, were rarely cleaned. The pits below filled faster than anyone could manage. When they overflowed, the stench could be smelled for blocks, and someone, usually a nightman or gong farmer, had to clean them out hand. That's where we meet some of the worst jobs in history. Gong farmers were paid to shovel human waste. They worked at night, in silence, covered in filth, dragging waste from pits to carts. They dumped it outside the city or sold it to farmers as fertilizer. Their pay was decent, but their status was the lowest. People avoided them in daylight. They weren't touched, spoken to, or welcomed in taverns, but they were necessary because, without them, towns would drown in their own excrement. In monasteries, places of holy silence and order, had their own stink. Monks followed a strict schedule, including communal bathroom breaks. They filed into rows of stone seats. They did their business in rhythm with bells and prayer, and then returned to their chambers with barely a word. Some monasteries had running water systems, basic aqueducts or drainage tunnels, but even those couldn't fully keep out the smell. And what about hygiene? After the act, There was no toilet paper. None people used straw, moss, leaves, handfuls of hay. Some used cloth rags, reused again and again in wealthier homes. Bits of linen were saved for wiping, but these were rare, and in many places, people simply used their hand and rinsed with water, if available. If not, they carried on. They had work to do. The smell of waste followed people everywhere, in the streets, in the fields, in their clothes, and because everyone shared it, no one questioned it. It was normal, expected, and often overwhelming on hot days. The odor thickened the air on rainy days. It soaked into the mud on feast days, when crowds gathered. The public privies overflowed, and people covered their mouths with cloth, or carried sprigs of mint to sniff. But no one escaped it, not even the royal court. In fact, some castles had entire rooms built for chamber pots, called stool rooms. They were attended by servants whose job it was to carry away waste. Even kings had a groom of the stool, a noble position responsible for managing the king's bathroom needs. That included wiping. Yes, wiping. It was a trusted role, because someone that close to the king's body held influence in the countryside. Nature was still the most common answer. Behind a hedge, in a field, near a stream, animals did it. So did people. The only rule was to go far enough from the water source, though that rule wasn't always followed. Disease spread easily. This way, cholera, dysentery, fevers with no name. Because when waste seeps into drinking water, everyone suffers, but few understood the connection. They blamed bad air. They blamed punishment from God. They did not blame the waste in the well, so they continued. They shouted their warning from the window. They emptied their buckets. They dug their pits, and they lived in the scent of their own making. Still, some tried to rise above it. They burned incense. They scattered rushes on the floor to absorb the smell. They washed their hands with vinegar, but nothing erased it fully. To relieve yourself in the medieval world was an act of endurance, of balance, of bravery. Sometimes because you never knew what you'd find in that dark corner behind the stable, or what creature might already be living in the pit. But you had to go, and so you went, and somehow, despite it all, people laughed, they joked, they teased each other. Children giggled at the sounds. Old men told stories in the privy, because this, too, was life, messy, unfiltered, human. In a world where everything smelled like something unpleasant, where sweat clung to linen and chamber pots steamed beneath every bed, people did what people always do. They got creative. They turned to the art of masking, of sweetening, of pretending, for a little while, that the air around them was not thick with filth and fire and flesh. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a shield, a scented armor against the constant assault of daily life. But medieval perfume was not sprayed from a glass bottle. It was not made with alcohol or preservatives or atomizers. It was something far more elementally. Began with flowers and herbs, roses, lavender, sage, thyme, cloves, cinnamon, rosemary, whatever could be grown, dried, boiled, crushed, or distilled. The wealthy might soak petals in oil for weeks, letting the fragrance seep deep. They might heat a mixture gently over flame, allowing the scent to rise. They might crush whole spices and add them to wax, then rub the blend onto their wrists or neck. Sand. The poor, they did what they could. They might tuck a sprig of mint behind the ear, or stuff dried lavender into their sleeves. Sometimes they chewed cloves or fennel, not for their breath, but to remind themselves there was something sweet in the world. There were no synthetic scents. Everything was natural, earthy, and often Faint, a noblewoman might smell of rosewater, but underneath, her gown carried the scent of old wool and sweat. A merchant might splash himself with vinegar infused with herbs, but his hands still held the scent of copper, and smoke. No perfume lasted long but for a moment. It lifted the spirit tanned. Then there was powder, not just for faces. Powder was everywhere. It was sprinkled on the body to absorb sweat. It was rubbed into hair to mask oil and odor. It was dusted onto undergarments, poured into shoes, shaken into gloves. Sometimes it was made from crushed chalk or clay, sometimes from ground rice or wheat. Sometimes it was mixed with dried herbs and roots, anything to feel a little cleaner, to smell a little better. The wealthy kept their powders in carved ivory boxes or glazed pottery jars. They had servants to apply it. They powdered their wigs, their linens, their bedding. Powder became a ritual, a way to say, I am refined, even when the privy stinks. In grand halls, bowls of crushed herbs sat near the hearth. Oranges, stuck full of cloves, were placed on tables or carried in hand. Guests might hold a scented kerchief to their nose while dining, not because the food smelled bad, but because the guests did. In banquets, with dozens of sweating bodies packed close together, under low ceilings and blazing torches, the air became heavy with breath and meat and fabric and time. And still, people tried. They burned incense, frankincense, myrrh, resin from distant lands. They hung dried bundles of herbs from rafters. They scattered sweet rushes on the floor, crushing them underfoot to release a scent with every step. In churches, the smoke of incense mingled with candle wax and stone dust. It was holy, yes, but also practical. It covered the smell of the faithful and of the dead. In palaces, the perfumer held power, not political, but olfactory. They knew how to mix oils, how to balance musk with flour, how to stretch a drop of rose until it clung to the skin for hours. They were prized, trusted, and expensive, but even the finest scent could not fully erase the world. The wind still carried the tannery. The market still steamed with fish and rot. The gutters still ran with waste, and every perfume, every powder, every pouch of herbs eventually gave way. But still, people kept trying, because scent was tied to more than comfort. It was tied to status, to memory, to desire. A woman who smelled of jasmine might be remembered longer. A knight who reeked of sweat might be passed over for one who smelled faintly of pine. People noticed, people whispered, people judged. Scent also had a place in medicine. Physicians believed that smell could balance the humors. A pungent scent might wake the sluggish body. A sweet one might calm the anxious mind. Garlic worn around the neck was believed to ward off plague. Rosemary boiled in wine was said to ease grief. People sniffed, rubbed, inhaled, and hoped. Perfume was not just a mask, it was a ritual, a comfort, a belief that even in filth there could be something beautiful. And so, the smell of the medieval world wasn't just one thing. It was layers. It was ash and rose, leather and lavender, garlic and sweat, myrrh and mildew. It was contradiction, and it was humana. Peasant woman might rise with the sun and brush wild mint into her hair before heading to the fields. A lord might dress in silk perfumed with civet, while beneath it his body begged for a wash. A monk might light incense and breathe deeply, chasing purity through smoke. A bride might crush rose petals in her palms, praying the scent would linger through the feast. And none of it lasted. Not the Scent, not the effort, but for a few brief moments, it helped people feel clean. It helped them feel worthy. It helped them endure a world that did not care how they smelled, only that they kept going, because that's what scent does. It softens. It shields. It reminds you that beneath the dirt, the toil, the long days and longer nights, you are still something more, still flesh, still soul, still human. There is a strange truth buried in the dust of the medieval world, a truth that feels upside down, almost backward to modern ears, because in that time, in those narrow streets and smoky halls, cleanliness wasn't always seen as healthy. Sometimes it was seen as dangerous, as something suspicious, as something that could invite illness instead of prevent it. Understand why. You have to step into their minds, into their science, into their fears. You have to forget what you know about germs and bacteria, and instead remember that the air itself was thought to be alive with sickness. They called it miasmith, the bad air. It moved like a shadow through alleys and halls. It clung to filth, yes, but it also stirred in water vapor, in steam, in perfume, in the wet breath of someone freshly washed bathing. Then was not always seen as safe, especially during outbreaks of disease, because to bathe, you had to open your pores to let the warm water loosen the skin, and once your pores were open, anything could slip inside: the wind, the cold, the plagues. So people avoided it. They avoided warm water, avoided bathing houses, avoided anything that might soften them too much. Hard skin was armor, sweat was a barrier, dirt was insulation. Doctors, men in robes and gloves and bird-like masks, soften advised against bathing too frequently. They believed it weakened the body, exposed it to invisible forces, made it soft, vulnerable. They recommended dry cleaning, instead wiping with cloth, changing linens, rubbing with vinegar, a touch of rose water. Maybe, but no full-body immersion, no steamy rooms with strangers, no scented oils on open skin. It sounds absurd now, but it made sense to them. They saw people bathe and then saw them die. They connected the two. They had no better explanation, and so public bathhouses, once lively and filled with laughter, fell silent. The doors were closed, the fires were put out, the steam faded, and the fear took their place. Even private bathing became a quiet thing, done in corners, in whispers, with one eye on the door. To wash too often was to tempt fate. To smell too good was to be unnatural. To be clean was, in some moments, to be accused. Then there were other dangers, too political ones, religious ones. Woman who spent too much time with her appearance might be labeled vain, or worse, which she must be using magic to keep her skin so clear, her hands so soft. What potions did she use? What spirits did she call better to keep her watched? Better to be cautious. Even monks, sworn to humility, were warned not to take pleasure in cleanliness. To wash too often was to flirt with pride. To care too much about scent or softness was to love the body more than the soul. And so filth became a kind of protection, a kind of proof that you were humble, that you were cautious, that you feared God and disease and the strange spirits of the air. Of course, not everyone believed this. Some clung to the older ways, to the belief that water could heal, that warm skin was not weak skin, that steam carried not sickness, but comfort. They bathed in rivers, in wooden tubs, in garden basins, behind thick walls. Quietly, privately, carefully, and still. They risked the whispers, because neighbors noticed. They always noticed. and a neighbor who noticed might ask questions, and questions, in those days, could be dangerous too. Even children weren't spared from this twisted thinking. Babies were sometimes kept unwashed for weeks, their skin rubbed only with lard or ashes to bathe them. Some believed was to invite a chill, and a chill could become a fever, and a fever could take a life before the sun rose again. So the smell of filth became the smell of survival. Better to stink and be safe than to be sweet and be sick. Yet beneath the fear, the human urge to feel clean never disappeared. People still longed for it. They longed for cool water on a hot day, for the simple weight of clean fabric on clean skin. They longed for the smell of herbs, the feeling of loosened hair, the sigh of muscles released into warmth. And so they found secret ways. They washed their hands in basins when no one was watching. They splashed their faces behind closed shutters. They rinsed their feet by lantern light, not to be perfect, not to be proud, just to feel human again in wealthier homes. Bathing never truly vanished. Tid just went underground. Tubs were brought to chambers, water heated in copper pots, curtains drawn. Servants sent away. A lady might bathe once a month, a lord before a feast. Slow rituals of half cleaning, half prayer. When the sickness passed, when the air seemed clear again, some would return to the baths, to the hot stones, to the fragrant oils, to the laughter echoing off the tiled walls, but never fully, because fear leaves a stain that no soap can reach. And so, for generations, the idea lingered that to wash was to risk, that to be clean was to be vulnerable. That mindset, though it shifted, left its mark. You can still see echoes of it today, in the way some traditions avoid bathing after birth, in the fear of drafts, in the belief that too much washing strips away health. It's a memory passed through centuries, not always spoken, but always present. So next time you stand beneath a stream of hot, clean water, next time you lather your skin with ease, remember those who could not, those who feared the very act, who ached to be clean but chose, instead, to survive, because, in their world, cleanliness was not next to godliness. Sometimes it stood dangerously close to death. Now close your eyes and imagine leaning in to speak with someone in a crowded medieval tavern. The fire crackles, the ale sloshes, the scent of smoke and damp wool fills the air, and then there it is, the unmistakable breath of a medieval mouth. Sharp, sour, metallic, a scent that could wilt flowers and curdle milk, because in the medieval world, mouths were battlegrounds, and the war against decay was almost always lost. There was no toothpaste, no floss, no minty rinse waiting by the basin. There were no dentists as we know them today, only barbers with strong arms and dull pliers, only herbs and hope. And yet, people still cared, they still tried, they rubbed their teeth with cloth, they chewed twigs to scrub away food. They rinsed their mouths with wine or vinegar or strong herbal infusions, not to whiten their teeth, but to fight the rot, because rot was real. Teeth turned black, they cracked, they bled, they fell out. Gums swelled, tongues ached, and breath turned foul. Before your first gray hair ever arrived, the causes were many. Bread ground with coarse stones left grit in every bite. That grit wore down enamel like sandpaper. Sugars, though rare when available, stuck, and fermented meat and fat rotted between molars. Ale coated the tongue in sticky film. There were no toothbrushes, no dental picks, only fingers, only sticks, only water. When it could be spared, some people used chewed hazel twigs or frayed bits of willow They would rub their teeth, not in circles like we do today, but up and down, mimicking the motion of chewing, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but they had to try, because a rotten tooth didn't just hurt it, and if it ruptured or spread deeper, there was no cure, no antibiotics, no gentle root canal, only knives, and prayer tooth extraction was brutal. A barber might hold you down, might grip the offending tooth with iron tongs, might twist and pull and twist again until it came free. The pain was blinding. There was no anesthetic, only wine or a piece of leather to bite, or the strength of your own fists clenching against the chair. Sometimes the tooth broke, sometimes the jaw fractured, sometimes the wound festered and turned black, but people kept going, because what choice did they have in? Still they worried about breath. They knew bad breath could ruin a deal, could chase away affection, could mark you as sick. So they chewed herbs, parsley, mint, clove, sage. They sucked on licorice root. They rinsed with spiced wine. They burned rosemary and breathed in the smoke. Anything to feel just a little fresher, even if the teeth behind that breath were crumbling in monasteries. Monks wrote down remedies, powders made from burned shells, elixirs of honey and vinegar, ointments made from crushed fennel. But none of it could stop the slow decay, only delay. If the rich suffered to gold, did not protect gums, sugar more accessible to the wealthy often made things worse by the end of the meal. Their teeth were coated in sticky sweetness. Some women rubbed their lips with honey to keep them soft, but it crept onto their teeth, fed the rot and the perfume of their breath, soured. With time, younger people often suffered the most by 20. Some had already lost several teeth by 30. Their smiles were gapped by 40. Many had none left at all, and yet they still smiled, still chewed, still kissed, because even in a world without dental care, people found a way to carry on. They adjusted. Their food softened, it soaked stale bread in broth-boiled vegetables until they turned to mush. They chewed slowly or not at all. Land there was shame, too, for the toothless, for the foul-breathed. Some wore cloth over their mouths. In church, some stopped speaking much at all. Not out of rudeness, but embarrassment and pain. Tried to fill gaps with wood or bone, crude false teeth, carved and tied in place with string or wire, uncomfortable, unsteady, but better than nothing, or so they told themselves. Mouth pain shaped lives, changed diets, changed habits, changed tempers. It made people short with each other, silent at meals, withdrawn during feasts, and yet still they cared. They cared about how they smelled, how they looked, how they were seen. A woman might chew cloves before a feast. A man might wash his mouth with wine before visiting a friend. Children were taught to spit after meals, to pick their teeth with chicken bones, to rinse with warm water. It wasn't science, but it was something, because even in the harshest conditions, people still reached for dignity, still tried to soften the world, still tried to make a good impression. And when they lost the fight, when the tooth fell, when the gums bled, when the pain flared deep in the jaw, they bore it, grimaced through it, wrapped warm cloth around their face, and waited for the ache to pass. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it followed them to the gravand. So the medieval mouth remains one of the darker corners of that history, not because people didn't care, but because they didn't stand a chance. Yet they kept eating, kept kissing, kept laughing, because even with broken teeth and sour breath, they were still human, still alive, still reaching for the next bite of bread, the next sip of ale, the next reason to smile, no matter how crooked that smile had become. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, human mess of bodies in motion, of blood and milk and tears of childbirth and sweat, and it shaped their lives more intimately than any chamber pot or privy ever could. Cleanliness for medieval women wasn't about perfume or powder, it was about survival. It was about controlling what little they could in a world that gave them so little. Controlled childbirth was where it all began, not just for the child, but for the woman herself. It was a ritual of pain and risk, of closeness and blood, and it was anything but clean. There were no hospitals, no sterile gloves, no antiseptics, just a small room, a midwife, a few other women, boiling water, strips of linen, prayers whispered into clenched hands. When labor came, it came hard and long. It could last hours, sometimes days. The woman might lie on a straw mattress, or grip the edge of a birthing stool, or crouch on the floor, legs trembling, head swimming in. When the child finally emerged, slick with blood and fluid, that waste it stained everything. Sheets were burned or boiled. Midwives washed their hands in vinegar. Ashes were scattered over the floors, and still, a woman who'd just given birth was considered vulnerable. Her body was open, her spirit unsettled. She was often kept in confinement for weeks, wrapped in cloth-fed warm broth, shielded from cold winds and visitors, not out of luxury but out of fear, because a single chill. No modern hygiene, just cloth rags folded and pinned, washed when they could be reused until they fell apart. Women. Before childbirth came something else. Monthly, bleeding menstruation was not understood. It was feared, mocked, whispered about. Women were bled into their skirts, washed in cold water, scrubbed with vinegar, hid the stains with darker diamond. Said it was unclean. Doctors said it was dangerous. Priests said it was spiritual. But women just endured it, month after month, year after year, and through it all there was sweat. The quiet. Women sweated beneath their linen shifts, beneath woolen dresses, beneath aprons crusted with flour or blood or soil. They bathed when they could, when the water was warm, when the children were asleep. When the midwife brought herbs to boil in the copper pot, they used mint and rosemary and bay leaves. They rubbed their armpits with vinegar, washed their hands, was braided and wrapped, pinned and tied, covered with a veil, washed with rainwater, or beer combed with care to pull out, because a tangled mat of hair could become a nest of itch and infection. So women tended to each other. Mothers combed, daughters, sisters, passed from woman to woman, never written down but always known, and in the rare moments brush their hair, rinse their hands in lavender, not for anyone else but for themselves, a small act of care, of calm, of reclaiming their own bodies, because those bodies were rarely theirs. They were for childbirth, for labor, for comfort, for carrying everything. Water, to feel like more than just a vessel for work, even in the hardest seasons, even when the water froze. Even when the cloth was stiff with use, they still cared. They still noticed the scent of their own skin, the feel of their hair against their neck. The warmth of a basin after dark. Cleanliness wasn't something they had, it was something they reached for every day in small, defiant acts, because to be a woman in the medieval world was to be told again and again that your body was unclean, that your blood was a curse, that your sweat was shameful, that your needs were invisible. And still they persisted, still they found ways to cleanse, to soothe, to feel human. They weren't clean by modern standards, not by any stretch, but they were strong and tender and resourceful, and in the flicker of a candle, in the steam of a basin, in the scent of crushed herbs against their wrists, they found something like peace. There was a time in the medieval world when the idea of cleanliness wasn't just private. It was public, shared, celebrated, wrapped in steam and warmth and soft voices echoing off tiled walls. Public bathhouses were once the heart of cleanliness. And not just physical cleanliness, they were centers of conversation, of business, of pleasure, of rest in cities across Europe. Especially in the earlier medieval centuries, bathhouses thrived. The tradition had roots in Rome carried forward by memory and stone. And though the marble was chipped, though the grandeur faded, the custom endured. Day public bathhouse wasn't just a place to rinse your feet or dunk your head. It was an experience. You walked in from the muddy street, from the smells of leather and fish and dung, and suddenly found yourself in a different world. Warm air, lantern light dancing on wet walls, laughter rising like steam, the splash of water, the murmur of gossip. Men and women often bathed separately, but not always, and not everywhere. In some places, mixed bathing was common, accepted, even expected. People stripped, wrapped themselves in linen or not at all, sank into the water and sighed away the weight of the world. There were attendants to heat the stones, to pour hot water into the tubs, to offer soap made from ash and fat, rough, simple, effective. There were scrubbing benches, massage oils, even food and drink. It wasn't just about getting clean, it was about being human together. For the wealthy, there were private bathhouses or private hours. In the public ones, they brought their own servants, their own towels, their own scented oils, and spent hours soaking and socializing. For the poor, it was a rare treat, a coin saved, a visit earned after a harvest or a pilgrimage. Some towns even had bathhouses funded by the church or by charitable guilds. Because cleanliness was tied to health, to morality, to purity. But over time, that changed. Suspicion crept in whispers. Began they said the baths were sinful, that too much heat stirred desire, that nudity bred temptation, and sometimes it did. The lines between washing and pleasure blurred. Some bathhouses became dens of sex, of secret meetings, of whispered bargains and lingering touches, and that gave fuel to the fire. The preachers rose, the pamphlets spread, and people began to doubt it. Too, that the fear of disease, of plague, of miasma. People began to fear the bathhouse. They said, steam opened the skin, that shared water spread sickness, that evil things lurked in the corners of the tub. And in some places, the bathhouses closed, boarded up, condemned. In others, they lingered on, quieter, more hidden, a shadow of what they had been by the later Middle Ages. Public bathing had declined sharply in many regions. The fires went cold, the tubs cracked, the floors grew dusty, and with it something was lost, not just the clean skin, but the sense of community, of care, of shared humanity. Because the bathhouse was never just about water, it was about pausing, sitting, breathing together. It was a place where the cobbler might soak beside the night, where the merchant might laugh with the farmer, where walls fell, if only for an hour. Of course, not all places gave up the practice. In parts of Eastern Europe, and especially the Islamic world, bathing remained strong, structured, sacred hams. Public baths in the Middle East and North Africa were designed with elegance. They combined hygiene with ritual, with architectural beauty, with spiritual purpose. But in much of Western Europe, the baths faded, and with them, so did the culture of shared cleanliness. People turned inward, began to wash in private, if at all. The knowledge of water's comfort, of its power to connect, to renew, to level, was slowly forgotten, replaced with fear, with superstition. with shame, but the memory lingered in stories, in songs. In the ache of the body, after a long day's labor, people still longed for the bath, even if they couldn't say it aloud. Sometimes in secret, they would fill a wooden tub at home, heat water over the fire, and sink into it, alone. In that moment, they remembered the sound of voices, the warmth of steam, the feeling of being clean, not just in body, but in spirit. Because when the bathhouses were alive, so were the people in them. They sat shoulder to shoulder. They scrubbed each other's backs. They shared apples and stories and silence, and, in doing so, they reminded each other that no matter how filthy the streets, how heavy the work, how cruel the cold, there was a place just for a little while where warmth lived and the world felt clean again. Imagine, just for a moment, waking up in a medieval cottage on a damp morning. Your straw mattress crunches slightly beneath you. The air smells of wood smoke and damp wool, and your clothes, those same clothes you wore yesterday and the day before, stiff with sweat and dust. There is no fresh drawer to open, no closet of clean choices, just the shirt that hangs by the hearth, only slightly less filthy than the one on your back, because in the medieval world, laundry was not a routine chore. It was a full-scale operation, a rare, labor-intensive event that required time, strength, and the cooperation of nature itself. Clean linen was a sign of status, a kind of soft armor against the judgment of neighbors and the crawling itch of lice. And yet, getting anything truly clean, truly fresh, was nearly impossibly start. With the basics, soap existed, but not like the scented bars we know now. It was rough, homemade stuff made from animal fat, boiled with ashes, sometimes mixed with herbs, sometimes not. It smelled more like smoke and lard than lavender or lemon, and it worked not well, but it worked enough to loosen the worst of the grime water. Though was the real obstacle, you needed a lot of it, gallons and gallons, and most people didn't have running water. So laundry began with the walk to the stream buckets, sloshing fingers, already cold, and their kneeling on the rocks. Women began. The work clothes were soaked, beaten with wooden paddles, scrubbed with handfuls of gritty soap, rinsed in icy water, wrung out by hand, twisted until the water fell away in silvery streams. It hurt, the cold stung the bones, the weight of the wet cloth pulled at the muscles. It was slow and endless, and drying was its own battle. On good days, the sun helped. Clothes were hung over bushes, laid on hedges, stretched across ropes or fence posts. But on bad days, when rain or fog clung to the air, the clothes stayed damp for hours, sometimes for days. So people wore damp shirts or no shirts, or just waited, shivering, until the fire could warm something dry. Because clothing was limited, most people had only one or two outfits, one set for daily work, one for Sunday church, if they were lucky. And linen, though it was easier to wash than wool, still took time to clean, to bleach. To dry wool was worse. You couldn't scrub it too hard. It shrank, it warped, so it was brushed, aired, beaten, more soothed than cleaned. And that's why smell was everywhere, in the sleeves, in the armpits, in the folds where sweat had soaked in weeks ago and never truly left. People tried to manage it. They sewed herbs into their underclothes, sprinkled ashes into their shoes, laid their linens out on frosty mornings to let the cold purify them in silence. In monasteries and noble houses, laundresses were employed full-time. It was considered a lowly job, but essential. These women knew every stain, every wrinkle, They knew how long to boil linens without burning them, which soaps worked best on blood, how to dry shifts without scorching them by the fire. They were strong, quiet, endless in their work hand. Their hands were always red, always cracked, always stained with soap and smoke for the wealthy. Clothes were cleaned more often because they had more and because others did the work. But even their wardrobes were not fresh by modern standards. Their fine gowns were brushed, not washed, perfumed, not scrubbed. A nobleman might change his shirt daily, but that shirt would still carry the ghost of last week's feast, of last month's ride through the woods, and so bedding, too, was washed only when necessary. Sheets and blankets, heavy with sweat and soot, taken out, shaken, beaten with sticks, scrubbed if needed, hung high across courtyards like sails. And lice, always lice. Laundry wasn't just about smell, it was about control, about keeping the crawling world at bay. People boiled their linens to kill the eggs, combed the seams, shared remedies with neighbors, vinegar, herbs, strong sun, strong prayers, and still they returned, because in a world of wool and sweat, of shared beds and crowded cottages, cleanliness was temporary. But people kept trying because fresh linen against the skin felt like grace, because even the faint scent of dried rosemary in your shirt could carry you through a hard morning, because to be clean, even for an hour, was to remember that you were more than just labor and dirt, that your body still mattered, that your skin still breath-tanned. So the rhythm of laundry shaped the weeks. Some villages had communal wash days, where the stream filled with laughter and gossip, where women compared cloth and bruises and stains. It was work, yes, but it was also community. Even in castles, the laundry was an orchestra. Servants boiling water, lifting heavy pots, stretching sheets across frames, ironing with heavy stones or glass balls. The smell of smoke and soap, the creak of drying wood, the slap of wet fabric against stone. It was the sound of care, of effort, of holding on to something good in a world that rarely offered it hand. So, no matter how filthy the roads became, no matter how sour the air inside a cottage could grow, there was always the dream of a warm shirt, of clean sheets, of resting your body in something that didn't stink of yesterday. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it mattered. It reminded them that even in mud, even in sweat, even in a world where water had to be hauled, boiled, and blessed, they could find something close to comfort, and for a while that was enough. The medieval world had a smell, not just a passing odor, but a presence, a constant, clinging thing that lived in every street, every room, every breath you took. And somehow people survived. It even grew used to it, even forgot it was there, until a stranger visited or a storm stirred it all back into the air. The stench was not one smell, it was many layered, stacked like rotten wood in a forgotten cellar. There was the smell of sweat, of bodies packed into small spaces, of wool soaked in rain and dried by fire, of unwashed hair, of skin wrapped in the same shirt for weeks. There was the smell of the privy, whether indoors or out. The waste never fully vanished. Chamber pots filled the corners of rooms. Outhouses leaned over pits that hadn't been emptied in years. The streets ran with it when the rain came, and when the sun baked the stone, it rose again like a ghost. There was the smell of animals, chickens in the courtyard, goats beneath the stairs, horses in the alleys, manure, hay, wet fur, Beth, feathers, all mixing together in the very places people slept and ate. There was the market, the butcher's stall, where flies never left. the fishmonger's barrel filled with scales, and brined the cheese that curdled into its own breath, the bread that turned sour, the fruit that never made it to ripeness. And there was smoke. Every home had a hearth. Every village had chimneys puffing gray into the sky. The smoke crept into clothes, into skin, into lungs, and yet people lived there. Noses adjusted slowly, without fanfare. They grew numb to it. What would make you gag today? Barely raised an eyebrow then, because it was everywhere, because they had no memory of anything else. Still, they weren't unaware. They noticed when someone smelled worse than usual, when an illness changed the scent of sweat, when rot moved in where it hadn't been before. They burned herbs to cover it, carried scented cloths, stuffed flowers in their sleeves, chewed mint and cloves and fennel, not just for breath, but to give the nose something sweet, to cling to. Physicians believed the nose could protect the soul, that breathing good smells warded off bad spirits. So they stuffed beak-like masks with roses and camphor and spice. They carried pomanders, little balls of perfume tied to belts, worn around necks, held to the face. In crowded streets, even common people found ways. They hung dried lavender near the bed. They scattered sweet rushes on the floor. They simmered rosemary in pots, hoping the steam would cleanse the air. And still, the smell returned, because filth was never far, because washing was rare, because trash was tossed from windows, because pigs ate what people dropped, because shoes dragged it all back in again. So the nose became something tough, something trained. Children grew up in it, learned the smells of illness, of spoiled food, of trouble, by scent alone. And still, there were moments when the stink broke through on hot days, when sweat soured faster, when the gutters baked, when breath turned sharp in your face on feast days, when too many bodies packed into a hall, when the scent of meat couldn't cover the scent of menon. Sick days, when fever made the skin smell different, when wounds turned black, when the air around the dying took on a heaviness no herbs could lift. But people survived. They found comfort in what they could control. A sprig of mint, a washed linen, a cloak aired out in the wind. They told themselves it wasn't so bad. They got used to breathing through the mouth, to turning their heads, to blaming the pigs, and too joked about smelly neighbors, wrote poems about foul breath and worse feet, because sometimes all you could do was laugh. The nose, like the body, was resilient. It forgot, it adapted, it found sweetness where it could, in a freshly cut herb, in the clean sweat of hard work, in the soft smell of bread still warm. So no, the medieval world was not clean, but it wasn't unaware either. They noticed, they endured, and when they could, they escaped, even if only for a moment, even if only in a garden filled with thyme, or a chapel filled with smoke and song, or a lover's sleeve filled with crushed rose petals. The stench was real, but so was the effort, so was the resilience. Sand, so was the nose, always searching, always surviving, one breath at a time. In a world where water was scarce and sweat was constant, where the streets reeked of waste and the air itself seemed heavy with filth, you might think that no one cared about smelling sweet or looking smooth, but that would be wrong, because even in the Middle Ages, even in a world without soap aisles and salon chairs, people still longed to feel clean, to smell pleasant, to care for their skin and body in ways that made life just a little more bearable. And so they improvised, they experimented, they passed down recipes and rituals through whispered words and folded parchments, not from doctors, but from mothers to daughters, From apothecaries to noble ladies, from bath attendants to queenslets. Start with the scent, the simple desire, not to offend the nose of your neighbor, because in a world where bathing might happen once a month or once a season, people needed alternatives. They turned to nature. To gardens and spice shelves, they crushed herbs like sage, mint, and rosemary, dried lavender blossoms, and stuffed them into linen sachets, hung sweet-smelling plants in doorways, and tucked them into sleeves and bodices. People rubbed their underarms with vinegar to cut through odor, or mixed powdered alum with crushed leaves to create a kind of primitive deodorant. Some used rose water not just for fragrance, but because it was believed to be cooling. A noble lady might dab her wrists with a cloth soaked in orange blossom. A servant might carry a sprig of thyme or basil pinned to her apron, not for fashion but for survival. And though the perfumes of the day were heavy and oil-based, they still held power. They masked sweat, they masked sickness, they turned heads. Even the clergy, so often seen as above vanity, burned sweet-smelling resins during services because people believed that a pleasant aroma could purify the soul, could keep evil spirits at bay, could lift the heart in a time when joy was in short supply. Then there was hair. Not the hair on your head, but the hair elsewhere, hair that in some cultures today might be left alone, but in many medieval circles, particularly among the elite, was seen as something to remove. The tools were crude bronze tweezers, rough threads, scraping stones, but the goal was the same. Smoothness. Hairless skin was associated with beauty, with cleanliness, with grace. Some women made pastes from lime and arsenic mixed with vinegar, spread it on their legs or arms, waited for the tingling to turn to burning, and scraped it off with a dull blade or sharp shell. It hurt, it often scarred, but it was worth it to them. Other remedies involved heated wax made from honey and resin, applied by hand and ripped away, a primitive wax strip. Painful, effective, and sometimes dangerous, because infections followed, blisters formed, and yet they continued. Because to be hairless was to be beautiful, to be desired, to be envied. In certain courts, eyebrows were plucked into fine. High arches. Foreheads were extended by removing hair entirely. Women rubbed pumice stone along their hairlines to give their faces a longer, more celestial look. And as for the skin, it was both worshipped and feared. A clear, pale complexion was the standard of beauty. It meant you were wealthy enough to stay indoors, to avoid the sun, to avoid labor. And so they whitened their skin with mixtures of lead and vinegar, with powdered chalk, with crushed pearls and egg whites. They smoothed it onto their faces like a mask, layer after layer, until the skin beneath barely breathed of. Course, the lead was poison, and over time it turned the skin gray. It caused ulcers, it made the teeth fall out, but still they used it because beauty was worth the risk. Others turned to less deadly options. They ground almonds and honey into facial pastes. They used goat milk or wine to rinse their cheeks. They applied masks made from bread soaked in rosewater or cucumbers, crushed with mint and thyme for those who could not afford such luxuries. There were simpler remedies: washing the face with cold water before sunrise, rubbing in animal fat to protect against windburn, using ashes mixed with oil to exfoliate the skin after a long day in the fields. Seven men took care, especially those of noble rank. They oiled their beards, brushed their hair, used tooth powders made from crushed shells or charcoal, not out of vanity, but because appearance meant status and status meant survival. The truly wealthy could hire attendants to maintain their grooming, to pluck stray hairs, to comb lice from their heads, to rub salves into their backs. It was pampering, yes, but it was also a ritual of maintenance in a world that seemed constantly out of control for peasants. There were fewer choices, but still they tried. They bathed in rivers. When they could, they dried herbs in the rafters for special occasions. They saved the ashes from the hearth to make soap when fat was available, a wedding, a festival, a saint's day. These were excuses to try and look clean, to smell sweet, to feel something like new. And in the midst of all this, there was always the balance between superstition and science, between faith and vanity. A priest might warn against excessive grooming, might say it fed pride, might say it tempted sin, but a mother would still teach her daughter how to comb out her hair each morning, how to dry her feet properly so they didn't crack, how to scrub her palms with rosemary after handling meat, because caring for the body wasn't just vanity, it was dignity, it was resistance. It was one small way to feel human in a world that often treated people like beasts. And so they scraped, they rubbed, they plucked, they powdered, not perfectly, not safely, not always successfully, but with intention, with memory, with care. And even now, centuries later, their recipes linger in dusty manuscripts, their rituals echo in our own mirrors, their desire to be clean, to be lovely, to be seen remain. So here we are, centuries away, surrounded by soft towels, scented soap, hot showers that run on command, toothpaste that sparkles, perfume in glass bottles, lined up like tiny miracles on bright bathroom shelves, sand. Yet, if you listen closely, beyond the hum of modern plumbing, beyond the hiss of clean water and the buzz of electric razors, you can almost hear it. A whisper from the past, from the dirt, from the bodies that bent to scrub and soak and scrape with hands stained by ash and lies. Didn't have what we have, not the marble countertops, not the fresh laundry on demand, not the aisles of options. But they tried, they always tried, because to be clean was never just about removing filth. It was about dignity, about identity, about reclaiming something gentle in a world that could be brutally hard. A peasant woman boiling her linens in a battered pot, a monk rinsing his hands before prayer, a noble lady rubbing rose oil behind her ears. They weren't so different from us. They wanted to feel new. They wanted to be touched by grace. Ivan, the gong farmer, waist deep in the waste of the world, knew that his job kept the sickness at bay, that beneath the stink was purpose, a strange, dark kind of purity. And now here we sit in rooms warmed by central heat, lighting candles for the scent, not the necessity, reading about their struggles while wrapped in clean blankets, as if the distance between then and now is miles and not just muscle memory, but it's all still with us in our rituals, in our longing for comfort, in the small relief of a freshly laundered shirt. So maybe next time we step into a hot shower or sink into a clean bed, we'll remember them, the hands that scrubbed, the backs that bent, the bodies that bore dirt and blood and sweat with quiet courage, because in the end, cleanliness is not just a modern luxury. It's an ancient act of hope, of healing, of holding on to humanity, one wash at a time.